My name is Amelia Carter. I am 29, a registered nurse, and this story begins with my father deciding I was too expensive to save. I lay in a coma with tubes in my throat and monitors above me when Richard Carter told Dr. Jonathan Hale, "Let her go." He did not whisper. He did not shake. He spoke as if canceling a subscription, as if my life were a fee he no longer wanted to pay. At 11:18 on a Tuesday night, Richard Carter signed a do not resuscitate order while I lay unconscious and fighting to stay alive. The doctors had not said I was beyond saving. The billing department gave him a number, and that number mattered more to him than I did. 3 weeks later, bruised, broken, and barely able to lift my head, I woke up and learned the DNR was only the beginning. What I did in the next 24 hours did not only save me, it shattered everything Richard Carter had built around himself. He never saw it coming because he forgot one thing about me. I had survived him my entire life long before I survived that crash. Before I take you there, hear this clearly. Some families do not protect your life. Some only protect their comfort, money, and image. To understand why Richard Carter signed that paper so easily, I have to take you back 7 months to Margaret Price and her final warning. I was born with a hole in my heart, a ventricular septal defect. That was the medical phrase. The emotional cost lasted much longer. I was 4 years old when surgeons opened my chest. The procedure lasted 11 hours, but the bill marked my life far more deeply. My mother, Helen Carter, tried to move forward. Richard Carter never did. To him, I was never a child. I was an invoice. I was 8 when Richard Carter first said, "You know how much you cost this family, Amelia Carter?" I remember every word. I had only asked for new sneakers because mine were cracked at the sole, and rainwater kept soaking my socks on the way home. He sat at the kitchen table with medical bills spread before him and never looked up while he named the cost of my childhood aloud. $214,000, Richard Carter said. That is what you cost this family. I never got the sneakers I needed. After that, I stopped asking for anything. It felt safer to need less than to hear my life translated into debt again and again. By 12, I had learned silence. By 15, I babysat 3 houses on our block just to buy my own notebooks and pens. Every supply I carried to school felt lighter than the guilt Richard Carter had taught me to carry like a permanent second skin. At 18, I signed my first student loan alone, while my older sister, Vanessa Carter, packed for college fully funded by my parents. Nobody in our family called it unfair. They acted as if this division had always made sense, as if I had been born owing more. Vanessa Carter got a car at 16. I rode the bus. Vanessa Carter got tuition paid. I got a repayment schedule and grace periods. Vanessa Carter had restaurant birthdays and wrapped gifts. I got boxed cake, a quiet kitchen, and a card signed only by Helen Carter. The hardest part to explain is this. I was not openly angry. I genuinely believed I owed them everything they denied me. Richard Carter repeated the same sentence so often that it became part of my identity, as familiar as the scar across my chest. You cost this family everything. He said it until I stopped hearing it as cruelty and started hearing it as the truth about me. I wore that guilt the way I wore my nurse badge every day without thinking, as if debt and service were my natural state. The only person who never mentioned what I had cost was my grandmother, Margaret Price, and that alone felt like sunlight. Margaret Price lived in a small brick house on Elm Street in Norristown, Pennsylvania, with a porch swing that creaked in the wind. 2 bedrooms, 1 bathroom, aging wood floors, and a garden she kept alive through winters most people would have surrendered to. She had lived there 41 years, raised Helen Carter there, buried her husband there, and kept every memory carefully in place. I started visiting Margaret Price every Saturday when I was 23, fresh out of nursing school and drowning in student debt. I drove 40 minutes each way, carrying groceries, blood pressure cuffs, and the kind of attention people only give where love feels safe. We sat on her porch swing while she asked about my week, my meals, my exhaustion, my heart, and whether I was sleeping enough. She never once said I owed her for gasoline, time, groceries, or care. She gave what she gave without turning it into leverage. When Margaret Price looked at me, I was not a burden. I was not a bill. I was simply her granddaughter, and that healed something. Near the end, her hands shook, but her mind was steady. She leaned close and told me something I did not understand then. "I have taken care of things for you, Amelia Carter. When the time comes, a man named Henry Kessler will find you." I smiled and squeezed her hand because I thought medication had made her confused. I did not know she was planning my survival. Richard Carter hated that I visited her. He called the drives wasteful and said Margaret Price barely remembered my name anymore. That was a lie. Margaret Price remembered everything, including things Richard Carter desperately wished would stay buried in the dark. She died quietly one Thursday in March, in her brick house, in her own bed, with a life of quiet endurance behind her. Richard Carter organized the funeral quickly, efficiently, almost impatiently, as if grief were another item to handle before lunch. He would not let me read a eulogy. At the funeral home door, he said, "Keep it short. We are not making a spectacle." So I stood in the back row and said goodbye to Margaret Price in silence while the people who loved appearances controlled her ending. She had told me Henry Kessler would find me. I still did not know who he was or why she had trusted him over family. The meaning of that name stayed hidden until a crash, a coma, a signed death order, and a hospital bed made every word clear. 3 months after the funeral, I left a 12-hour overnight shift at St. Catherine's and drove home under light rain and streetlights. It was 4:17 in the morning on Route 202, and I was calculating how many hours of sleep I could squeeze in before work. 6 if I skipped breakfast. 5 if I showered. Those were the last ordinary thoughts I remember having before everything broke apart. A pickup truck ran the red light going 50 and slammed into the driver's side of my car hard enough to fold steel inward. I do not remember the sound. I do not remember the glass. I do not remember pain arriving. Only the fact that it did. The paramedics later said I was conscious for about 90 seconds after impact, long enough to tell them my name before I vanished. Traumatic brain swelling, 4 broken ribs, and internal hemorrhaging followed me into the emergency room at my own hospital, St. Catherine's. The team opened me up within the hour. They needed a second surgery, more time, a specialist, and someone to authorize the decision. I had no husband and no children. The emergency contact on file was still Richard Carter because he had insisted it remain that way. The hospital called Richard Carter at 10:30 that night. He arrived at 10:47, and the front desk logged the exact minute. He did not go to my room first. He did not ask whether I had opened my eyes or whether I was scared or in pain. Richard Carter went straight to billing and asked only one question. "How much is this going to cost?" That was his first concern. I learned the rest from Patricia Reed, our head nurse, a woman with 28 years on the floor and a memory like steel. Patricia Reed was at the station when Richard Carter left billing and found Dr. Jonathan Hale, the surgeon overseeing my case. He asked for the estimate on the second surgery. Dr. Jonathan Hale told him it could be $180,000 to $240,000. Insurance would cover part, but there would still be significant out-of-pocket costs, especially because Richard Carter had tied himself to my accounts. Years earlier, when I was 18, he had insisted on co-signing older medical paperwork. I had thought it was help. It was control. Richard Carter did not blink at the price. He said I had no healthcare proxy and claimed he was the sole decision-maker. That was when Dr. Jonathan Hale followed protocol and listened, because next of kin steps in if no proxy is on file. Then Richard Carter spoke the sentence that will stay in my body longer than the crash itself. "Let her go. We won't pay." Patricia Reed said Dr. Jonathan Hale stared at him for a long time, waiting perhaps for shame, regret, or any human hesitation. None came. Richard Carter added, "She's been a financial drain her whole life," and then asked for the DNR paperwork. He signed the order with a steady hand, no trembling, no pause, no goodbye, and no visit to the daughter he meant to abandon. He placed the pen down, asked whether there was anything else he needed to sign, and walked toward the elevator without looking back. He never stood outside my room. He never watched through the glass. He never said my name where I might have heard it. Behind the nurse's station, Patricia Reed gripped the counter so hard her knuckles went white, but she chose action over outrage. Instead of screaming, Patricia Reed sat down and opened my employee file, the one every nurse completes during onboarding at St. Catherine's. Contact information, allergies, insurance, emergency contacts, and a healthcare proxy section that most people ignored. I had not ignored it. 3 years earlier, I had named Sophie Bennett as my healthcare proxy, my best friend from nursing school and my chosen family. Her name, number, and relationship were clearly listed in my file. Patricia Reed found them in under 2 minutes. She called Sophie Bennett at 11:14 p.m. and explained the crash, the coma, the surgery, and a father trying to let me die. Sophie Bennett did not waste a second on shock or discussion. She said only, "I am leaving now," and drove into the rain. She came from Cherry Hill through 90 wet minutes of highway darkness with her license, a copy of the proxy, and shaking hands. Sophie Bennett arrived at St. Catherine's at 12:51 a.m., soaked by weather and fear but fully prepared to fight for me. She revoked the DNR immediately. She authorized the surgery. She gave my life back its legal permission to continue. Within the hour, Dr. Jonathan Hales scrubbed in again. By then, Richard Carter was already home, asleep, believing morning would bring my death. He had no idea the DNR had been overturned. He believed the machines would stop, and the hospital would call with confirmation by sunrise. No one called him. Not Patricia Reed, not Sophie Bennett, not the hospital. Silence kept him comfortable while truth kept me alive. Before her shift ended, Patricia Reed did one more thing that would later become a blade Richard Carter could not dodge. She opened an internal incident report and documented every word she had heard, every timestamp, every false claim, and the DNR signature. She noted that Richard Carter had lied about my proxy, signed the order, and treated my life like an optional financial burden. Then Patricia Reed locked her computer, sat alone in the break room for 20 minutes, and let anger settle into evidence. That same next morning, while I remained unconscious, Richard Carter made his second mistake, one even greedier than the first. He woke expecting a call announcing my death, a time of death, perhaps forms, perhaps sympathy, perhaps the performance of a grieving father. Instead of calling the hospital himself, instead of checking whether I was breathing, he decided to steal Margaret Price's house. What I did not know then was that Margaret Price had already transferred the Norristown house into my name before she died. The deed had been handled privately through Henry Kessler, legally filed with the county, clean, official, and hidden from Richard Carter. Richard Carter only knew that Margaret Price was gone, the house sat empty, and property was something he did not intend to lose. He produced a power of attorney with my signature on it. I had never signed it. He copied my handwriting from old forms. Those forms came from my late teens, from medical paperwork he once made me sign when I trusted his directions without question. He brought the forged document to a notary he knew, Carl Benson, a man willing to stamp paper without asking dangerous questions. Carl Benson notarized the false power of attorney. With that, Richard Carter filed a deed transfer at the county recorder's office. By Thursday, the house had been transferred into Richard Carter's name, at least on paper, though the truth underneath had not changed. By Friday, he walked into a bank and leveraged the property, pulling out a mortgage worth $280,000. The cash did not go toward my surgeries, debts, or recovery. It vanished into gambling losses nobody in the family even knew existed. Not our relatives, not our neighbors, not our church, not the people who praised his discipline and generosity every Sunday morning. Richard Carter never knew the house had first been given to Amelia Carter by Margaret Price through proper probate and recorded deed. He certainly did not know what role Henry Kessler played, or how dangerous a forged signature becomes once the right eyes inspect it. Fraud survives only while people stay passive. Richard Carter had spent years depending on silence, fear, and everyone's need to keep peace. He forgot that paperwork leaves trails, and that some people, like Henry Kessler, are trained to follow them all the way down. I opened my eyes on a Tuesday, 3 weeks after the crash, under the cold blue-white hospital light I knew too well. The breathing tube had been removed, but my throat still felt bruised from the inside, as if silence itself had scraped it raw. My ribs screamed when I inhaled. My left arm rested in a soft cast. Even blinking felt heavy, expensive, difficult, and deliberate. The first face I saw was not Richard Carter, not Vanessa Carter, but Patricia Reed standing watch beside my monitors. When she saw my eyes open, Patricia Reed did not panic or cry. She pulled up a chair and took my hand. "You are safe," Patricia Reed said. "I need to tell you some things, but not until you are ready to hear them." I tried to speak and managed one broken whisper. "How long?" The answer came quietly. 3 weeks, surgery successful, survival still fragile. I closed my eyes because memory was returning in pieces. The truck, the red light, impact, and then a door opening somewhere nearby. Richard Carter arrived at my room at 2:17 that afternoon. I learned the exact time later because nurses record what matters. He stood in the doorway first, and I watched his face carefully as it rearranged itself from alarm into practiced tenderness. I had read faces in hospital rooms for years. Fear of losing someone does not look like fear of being discovered. Richard Carter rushed to my bedside, took my hand, and began to cry with the kind of timing only habit can perfect. "Oh, sweetheart, we were so scared. Thank God you are okay," he said, tears falling exactly where witnesses could see. I looked at him, then at the trembling mouth, the wet eyes, the soft, fatherly voice I knew belonged to performance, not love. "Hi, Dad," I said, because there is a special kind of quiet reserved for moments when truth has not yet been exposed. That evening, Vanessa Carter sent flowers through an online florist, a generic bouquet that arrived without presence, touch, or apology. She did not visit. She sent a transaction and called it concern, which felt painfully familiar in our family. 2 days later, I could sit upright on my own. The hallway quieted during shift change, and Patricia Reed closed the door. She pulled the same chair beside my bed and stood for a moment, deciding where truth should begin when a lie has lasted years. "Just say it," I told Patricia Reed, because my body was already broken. Mystery would not protect me now. She told me Richard Carter came only once, the night of the accident, and went first to billing instead of to me. She told me he asked what the surgery would cost, then lied that I had no healthcare proxy on file. She told me he claimed sole authority, signed a DNR, and said words that matched what I had always felt beneath childhood. "Let her go. We won't pay for the surgery. She has been a financial drain her whole life." Exact words. Documented words. I was not shocked by the meaning. I was shocked only by hearing lifelong cruelty finally spoken with total clarity and no disguise. For years, I had felt like a line item. Now I knew I truly had been one to Richard Carter all along. I asked how I was still alive, and Patricia Reed told me about Sophie Bennett and the proxy hidden in my file. She explained how Sophie Bennett drove through rain, revoked the DNR, authorized surgery, and gave me back the future Richard Carter sold. I asked whether what he had done was on record. Patricia Reed nodded. Incident report filed, time-stamped, his words preserved. I stared at the ceiling for a long time, listening to monitors while 32 missed calls from Richard Carter waited on my phone. There were 11 missed calls from Vanessa Carter, too, but I scrolled past both names without touching either one. Then I opened my contacts and tapped the name Margaret Price had once given me. Henry Kessler. The phone rang twice before a calm, measured voice answered. "This is Henry Kessler." The name carried paperwork, patience, and authority. I introduced myself, but Henry Kessler gently interrupted. He had been trying to reach me for 4 months already. My ribs tightened as he explained that Margaret Price had come to him privately 2 years before she died. She had wanted a will done outside the family circle, outside anyone Richard Carter might influence, through Henry Kessler alone. The will was simple and absolute. The house on Elm Street to Amelia Carter and $85,000 to Amelia Carter. No shared names, no conditions, no committee, no family discussion, just a direct transfer from one woman who saw me to another. The probate had already been completed 5 months earlier, and the court had confirmed the transfer legally and cleanly. Henry Kessler said he mailed certified letters to my address, but someone had returned them and said I moved out of state. He also called my listed number, where a voice told him I did not want to be contacted anymore. I knew that voice. Even from a hospital bed, I knew Richard Carter had intercepted the inheritance and blocked me from the one thing left for me. I asked the question that mattered most. "Is the house still in my name, Henry Kessler?" Then I waited. There was a long pause as he checked current deed records. He promised to call back within the hour with the answer. After we hung up, Patricia Reed remained by the door, silent, while my grandmother's words echoed louder than the monitor beeps. Before the call ended, Henry Kessler had said something else. "Your grandmother told me you would call. She said you always come through." 53 minutes later, the phone rang again, and this time Henry Kessler's voice carried tension sharpened by new information. He told me the deed to Margaret Price's property had been transferred out of my name 3 weeks earlier. I counted the drops in my IV as if counting would hold me still enough to hear the rest without breaking apart. "Transferred to whom?" I asked, though I already knew the answer before Henry Kessler spoke it. "Richard Carter, using a power of attorney," he said. My hand stayed steady even while everything inside me went cold. I told him clearly that I had never signed any power of attorney and never authorized anyone to act for me. Henry Kessler confirmed that no such document existed through his office and that the transfer strongly appeared to be forged. Then came the next blow. He had run a lien search and found a mortgage recorded against the property 6 days earlier, $280,000. The number sat in my hospital room like another person breathing with us. "He leveraged the house," I said. Henry Kessler answered simply, "Yes, he did, because facts do not soften themselves." I reached for a pen on my bedside tray and wrote down every figure, date, recording number, and notary stamp. My hand did not shake. Maybe because I was beyond surprise. Maybe because I had spent 29 years studying Richard Carter. Some daughters learn to trust their fathers. I had learned instead how to recognize the shape of betrayal before it finished forming. Henry Kessler asked if I wanted to press charges immediately. I told him not yet. I needed the full depth first. Then he told me Margaret Price had left a sealed letter to be delivered only to me, in person, by him. I asked when he could come. He said 9 o'clock the next morning. I said I would be waiting. After the call ended, I turned to Patricia Reed and asked the exact time Richard Carter signed the DNR order. 11:18 p.m., she said. I wrote that down too, because truth is strongest when cruelty meets timestamps and paper trails. The next afternoon, Richard Carter returned carrying yellow roses and banana bread baked by Vanessa Carter, as if food could erase intent. He kissed my forehead, sighed heavily, and settled into the chair beside my bed like a man bearing noble suffering. I had watched this performance my entire life. The weary father, the silent provider, the one everyone praised for sacrifice. "The doctors say you will be out in a week," Richard Carter said warmly. "We will take care of everything." Vanessa Carter came too, standing at the end of my bed with her phone in hand and a smile that never reached her eyes. "We were so worried," Vanessa Carter said. "I couldn't sleep for weeks." She looked at the window as she said it. Richard Carter leaned close and lowered his voice, using the tone that made false comfort sound almost holy in public. "Don't worry about the medical bills, sweetheart. We will figure it out as a family. That is what families do." The man who signed my death order was now holding my hand and speaking softly about family duty and shared burdens. "As a family," I repeated back to him, smiling carefully, squeezing the same hand that once signed away my life. He smiled too, satisfied, believing his version still worked because he thought ignorance was still protecting him. They stayed 40 minutes. Richard Carter discussed weather and baseball. Vanessa Carter checked her phone 11 separate times. When the door finally shut behind them, I sat still for 10 seconds and then picked up my phone again. "Henry Kessler, bring the letter," I said when he answered, "and come as soon as you can in the morning." He arrived at 9 exactly, shorter than I imagined, in a gray suit with silver-rimmed glasses and a weathered briefcase. Henry Kessler shook my hand carefully around the IV line and told me Margaret Price mentioned me at every meeting. From his briefcase, he withdrew a sealed envelope with my name on the front in Margaret Price's thin, steady handwriting. I opened it slowly. Inside was a single folded sheet that smelled faintly of paper, time, and someone planning love in advance. Margaret Price wrote that she knew my father would try to take everything, just as he had already taken from her quietly. She admitted he had taken her pension, her savings, and more than she ever told me because she feared breaking the family apart. "That was my mistake," she wrote. "Do not make it yours." Even from the page, she was still protecting me honestly. She told me the house was mine, the money was mine, and that Henry Kessler held every paper needed to prove it. "Do not let anyone take what is yours," Margaret Price wrote. "Not even your father, especially not your father." Then came the sentence that cracked me open after weeks of pain, fury, and controlled survival. "You are stronger than me," I cried for the first time since waking, not because I was weak, but because Margaret Price had seen all of me. She had prepared for this moment with the quiet precision of someone who knew love sometimes has to become legal protection. When I could breathe again, Henry Kessler placed a thick folder on my blanket. "Will, probate papers, deed, lien search. Evidence. You have everything you need," he said. "What do you want to do?" My ribs hurt, but my answer came clear. I told Henry Kessler I wanted to do this right, publicly and before Sunday. He raised one eyebrow and waited. Sunday meant the monthly community gathering at First Grace Community Church, where Richard Carter served as a deacon for 15 years. This was the church where he read scripture, shook hands, raised funds, fixed furnaces, and wore goodness like an ironed shirt. Everyone there knew his name, his daughters' names, and the exact story he liked to tell about sacrifice and family devotion. Pastor after pastor praised Richard Carter as a man of faith and service. I had heard that sentence until it numbed me. Every first Sunday, the fellowship hall filled with casseroles, paper plates, prayer requests, and a standing microphone near the front. Richard Carter always spoke there. He liked blessing language, gratitude language, family language, all while hiding what he had done at home. 5 days after I woke, the hospital discharged me. I was still bruised, sore, slow, but fully capable of making decisions. Richard Carter arrived at 10 in the morning with a suitcase and announced I would be staying with them while I recovered. He did not ask. He declared it the way controlling people declare care, turning permission into obedience before you can object. I thanked him and told him Sophie Bennett was picking me up and that I would stay at her apartment instead. His face tightened only slightly, but I saw the calculation begin. "You'd rather stay with a stranger than your family?" he asked. I told him Sophie Bennett was no stranger. She had been my emergency contact for 3 years. Something flickered behind his eyes. He still did not connect it to the proxy, not yet. He picked up the suitcase and left without saying goodbye. That evening, Vanessa Carter texted me that Dad was upset and that I was being ungrateful after all he had endured. I read the message, set my phone down, and gave silence the dignity it deserved instead of wasting truth on manipulation. At Sophie Bennett's apartment, I sat at her kitchen table while Henry Kessler and I reviewed every filing and legal step. Motion to void the deed transfer, police report for fraud and forgery, notification to the mortgage lender about disputed title. Everything was ready. All I needed was timing, restraint, and the willingness to say aloud what everyone had trained me to swallow. That night, Richard Carter called and casually mentioned he was handling Margaret Price's estate matters, testing whether I knew anything. I thanked him sweetly and told him I appreciated him taking care of it. Then I hung up before contempt could color my tone. Sophie Bennett asked how I could sound so calm while speaking to the man who tried to let me die and rob me. "Practice," I told her. 29 years of practice. Survival had taught me tone control long before law ever entered the room. First Grace Community Church sat west of Philadelphia beneath a white steeple and a parking lot crowded by familiar Sunday routines. About 120 people attended weekly, families, retirees, teachers, business owners, all the faces that make a man's image sturdy. Richard Carter ushered at the door, read scripture from the lectern, and repaired homes for free when church members were in trouble. When the roof needed replacing, he led fundraising. When furnaces failed in January, he fixed them and refused payment with humble smiles. That is how reputations harden around men like him. Good works become camouflage, and the community mistakes usefulness for moral safety. The coming Sunday was the first of the month. I called Henry Kessler and asked him to be there by 11:30. He said he would. I sat on Sophie Bennett's couch, breathing carefully through sore ribs, planning not a scene but a reckoning. Sunday morning, I stood before the bathroom mirror and looked at the woman Richard Carter had failed to erase. The bruise under my eye had faded green. My jawline still held yellow traces. My collarbone hurt when I lifted my arm too high. I dressed simply in a white button-down shirt, black slacks, and the silver studs Margaret Price gave me at 21. I skipped makeup. I wanted the truth visible, not softened. I wanted every bruise to stand in the room with me. Into my bag went copies of the will, deed, lien search, and the redacted incident report with Richard Carter's words in ink. Sophie Bennett drove us to the church and parked near the back at 11:20 under bright sun and steady nerves. She asked if I was sure. I told her I had never been more sure of anything in my life. Near the entrance, Henry Kessler waited in his gray suit beside the flagpole, briefcase in hand, calm as ever. I entered during the service and slipped into the last pew while hymns drifted over old carpet, polished wood, and coffee. Richard Carter sat in the front row. When he saw me, his face brightened into proud relief, and he lifted a hand. I waved back. A small, patient wave, the kind that promises nothing except that a moment is coming and cannot be stopped. Vanessa Carter sat beside him and glanced at me without waving, her stillness already carrying the weight of what she knew. At noon, everyone moved into the fellowship hall where foil pans, folding chairs, and the microphone waited for familiar performances. Richard Carter took his place beside the microphone with hands clasped, ready to speak first as he always did. 120 people settled into chairs, children weaving between tables, plates stacked beside napkins, the room humming with trust. He tapped the microphone and began with a personal update. He always knew how to begin where sympathy would gather fastest. As many of you know, my youngest daughter, Amelia Carter, was in a serious car accident last month, he said. He described my coma, the uncertainty, the terror of almost losing me, pausing exactly where emotion needed room to bloom. Then he declared that God is faithful and gestured toward me as proof, smiling with practiced gratitude and paternal tenderness. The room turned. Applause rose around me, warm and genuine from people who had no reason yet to doubt his story. As a father, Richard Carter said, voice cracking beautifully, there is nothing more terrifying than almost losing your child. He added that he prayed every single night and never left my side. The lie landed in my chest like a key turning. Family is everything, Richard Carter said, looking at me with open arms as if love were waiting to be embraced. I smiled and walked toward him because sometimes the shortest path to truth is straight through the center of the lie. Dad, I said loudly enough for the front rows to hear, can I say a few words? He had no safe way to refuse. In front of 120 people who had just applauded my miracle, Richard Carter handed me the microphone and stepped aside. I held the warm microphone, looked at the room, and thanked everyone sincerely for their prayers and concern through my recovery. Then I said I needed to correct something Richard Carter had just told them. The fellowship hall fell instantly still. His smile faded by a degree so small most people missed it. I did not. I had always watched him closely. I said Richard Carter did not pray by my bedside. He came once the night of the accident and went to billing first. I told them he asked my surgeon what my second operation would cost before he asked whether I might survive it. Then I quoted the incident report exactly. Let her go. We won't pay for the surgery. She's been a financial drain. Silence hit the room like pressure. Someone inhaled sharply. A woman covered her mouth. No one reached for food or conversation. I told them Richard Carter signed a DNR order that night and left without seeing me, touching me, or saying goodbye. I said I was alive because Patricia Reed found my healthcare proxy and called Sophie Bennett in the middle of the night. I said my friend drove 90 minutes through rain to save me while my father went home believing the hospital would call with death. Richard Carter stepped toward me and told me to stop, that I did not understand, that this was not the place. I answered that he chose a church to lie in public, so I had chosen the same church for the truth. He claimed I was confused, medicated, emotional. I said I had the hospital record, the timestamps, and the documented statement. No one moved. 120 people simply listened, and for the first time Richard Carter had no control over the room. That was when the side door opened and Henry Kessler entered the fellowship hall with his gray suit and leather briefcase. He walked directly to the front without hurry, set the briefcase down, and stood beside me with the calm of legal certainty. When Richard Carter saw Henry Kessler, fear finally crossed his face, clear and unmistakable, and everyone nearby saw it. I introduced Henry Kessler as Margaret Price's attorney, and a murmur spread because her name still meant something in that church. I explained that Margaret Price left me her house and savings through a private will probated months before my accident. I said Richard Carter knew nothing about the inheritance because Margaret Price did not trust him with it or with me. Then I told the room what he had done while I was unconscious, forged my signature and transferred the house into his own name. I added that he used that stolen title to take out a mortgage for $280,000 against my property. A dish crashed somewhere in the back. A fork hit the floor. Shock moved through the room like cold water. Richard Carter shouted that I was lying, that Margaret Price left the house to the family, not to me alone. Henry Kessler opened his briefcase, lifted the original will, and displayed the notary seal to the front rows. In an even voice, Henry Kessler said the property belonged solely to Amelia Carter and that Richard Carter's name appeared nowhere. I lowered the microphone and spoke directly to Richard Carter. I was not there to humiliate him, only to tell what he did. I said he tried to let me die, and when that failed, he robbed me while I was unconscious and voiceless. Richard Carter turned to the room and claimed I was unstable, heavily medicated, and turning a private family issue into spectacle. From the back, a man asked the obvious question. If this was nonsense, why was a lawyer standing there with documents? Pastor Michael Turner spoke next, quietly but firmly, saying the room should hear the matter out before anyone dismissed it. Losing authority, Richard Carter switched tactics and softened his voice, falling back on sacrifice, debt, and fatherly hardship. He said my childhood medical bills nearly bankrupted the family and that he only did what he thought was best. I answered clearly, without shouting, that he did not do what was best. He did what was cheapest, and there is a difference. He began to speak about pressure, debts, and stress, but stopped himself too late. He had nearly admitted more than intended. Vanessa Carter stood from her chair then, face pale, and told him to stop talking before he made everything worse. Richard Carter grabbed her arm and told her to explain that he was protecting the family. She pulled away from him. Vanessa Carter looked at me, then at the floor, then toward the exit as if the room itself had become unbearable. "I can't do this," Vanessa Carter said. As she passed me, she whispered 6 words I will never forget. "I should have called Sophie Bennett myself." Then Vanessa Carter left, taking years of silence with her through the door. I turned back to the congregation and said I was not speaking to destroy my father, only to stop his false image. For 15 years, I said, Richard Carter stood at that microphone and told everyone who he was. They deserved the truth. Then I laid out the next steps. Henry Kessler had already filed to void the deed transfer based on forged authority. I said the bank had been notified the title was disputed, the mortgage was frozen, and the loan could not move further. I told Richard Carter I filed a police report for forgery and fraud and that Carl Benson was named in it too. His left hand started trembling. The room watched a man unravel in real time under the weight of actual documentation. "You would send your own father to jail?" Richard Carter asked, voice stripped raw now that the audience no longer protected him. I looked at him steadily and answered, "You signed a paper to let your own daughter die." No one breathed for a second. I told him I was not sending him anywhere. I was giving him a chance to make things right, which was more than he gave me. Henry Kessler closed his briefcase softly and said the filings were already with the court. This was no longer a negotiation. Richard Carter looked around the room for an ally, for one loyal face, one soft nod, one person willing to rescue his image. He found Robert Grayson, James Callahan, older women, young families, and church friends staring back without sympathy or movement. These were the people whose pipes he fixed, whose hands he shook, whose trust he wore like polished Sunday leather. None stepped toward him. None defended him. Silence became the judgment he had never expected from people he believed he had secured. Then Richard Carter sat on the nearest folding table instead of a chair and buried his face in his hands. Robert Grayson walked over and placed a firm hand on his shoulder, not cruelly, but with the finality of moral distance. "Richard Carter, I think you should leave," Robert Grayson said. The words ended his role there more cleanly than any sermon. Richard Carter stood and walked toward the door without sound. At the threshold, he turned as if searching for a closing speech. His eyes were red, his mouth open, but for once no polished line arrived. Performance had finally run out of script. He left without dignity, and the fellowship hall remained silent long enough for everyone to understand what had just happened. I set the microphone down and apologized to the room for disrupting Sunday, though the truth was long overdue. I said Margaret Price loved that church and would have wanted the truth spoken there, not hidden behind stained glass respectability. 2 women came forward and hugged me. A man shook my hand without words. Human decency returned once the lie left. Across the room, Patricia Reed stood near the coffee station and gave me one small nod that felt like a medal. Then an older woman touched my arm and introduced herself as Doris Harper, who had sat beside Margaret Price for 20 years. Doris Harper told me Margaret Price spoke about me every week and never stopped telling people how proud she was of me. I had spent years believing no one in that world truly saw me. Margaret Price had made sure they did. Within 24 hours, everything Richard Carter had built began to collapse under the weight of law, money, and truth. Monday morning, the lender's fraud department froze the mortgage after title records were flagged as disputed and unsupported. Henry Kessler received a call before noon confirming the loan was suspended and the bank could not proceed under fraudulent title. The $280,000 Richard Carter had already spent became his problem alone, unsecured by the house he stole. The county court accepted Henry Kessler's motion to void the deed transfer, and a process server reached Richard Carter that afternoon. At 3:15 p.m., a neighbor watched him receive the summons at his front door while pretending to collect mail nearby. Police opened a formal investigation into forgery and fraud, and Carl Benson quickly hired his own lawyer to cooperate. By Tuesday evening, the church board voted unanimously to remove Richard Carter from his position as deacon. Robert Grayson called him personally. Richard Carter did not argue and did not appear at the meeting to defend himself. His plumbing clients began canceling. 3 dropped him Monday, 5 more by Wednesday, most of them church members. James Callahan texted him only one sentence: "Don't come to my house again. Sometimes judgment arrives in simple language." That night, Richard Carter called me and said I had destroyed him. His voice sounded emptied out, no performance left. I told him he had destroyed himself. I had only stopped covering for him and stopped carrying shame that never belonged to me. He hung up, then called Vanessa Carter. She did not answer him either, and silence finally moved in his direction. Later that week, Henry Kessler uncovered another document from 3 years earlier that showed Richard Carter's planning had gone even deeper. My life insurance beneficiary had been changed from Sophie Bennett to Richard Carter, with my forged signature on the form. He had prepared for every version of my death, and none of those versions included saving me, protecting me, or grieving honestly. 3 days later, Vanessa Carter called while I sat on Sophie Bennett's couch with a heating pad over my ribs. Her voice was thick with tears before she even finished saying my name. "I need to tell you something," she whispered. I told Vanessa Carter to say it plainly. After years of silence, clarity was the only thing I was willing to hear. She admitted she knew about the DNR the night Richard Carter went to speak with Dr. Jonathan Hale at the hospital. She knew he intended to let me die, and she said nothing. She sat in the waiting room and let him proceed. Then she admitted she also knew about the house and the promise of $85,000 if she kept quiet. "And you kept quiet," I said. "Yes," Vanessa Carter answered, crying now because some truths burn when finally spoken aloud. She said she had always been scared of Richard Carter, always shaped by his anger, pressure, and the rewards of compliance. I told her fear explained many things, but it did not erase responsibility. It did not excuse what she let happen to me. Vanessa Carter said she was not asking for forgiveness. I told her she was right not to expect it yet. Still, I said I would not pretend she did not exist. If she wanted to rebuild anything, she knew where to find me. Then Vanessa Carter told me Margaret Price had left her a letter too, and I sat up straighter to hear it. The letter said, "I love you, Vanessa Carter, but you are too much like your father. Choose differently." I asked softly whether she had chosen differently. Vanessa Carter did not answer because we both already knew that answer. Forgiveness is not something I owe anyone, not even family. It is a door, and doors can stay closed until action earns entry. 1 month later, the deed to Margaret Price's house was legally returned to my name, exactly where she intended it to remain. Henry Kessler called at 10 that morning with the ruling. I thanked him, and he told me to thank Margaret Price. Then he said she would have loved seeing me stand in that fellowship hall and speak truth without lowering my eyes. Criminal charges followed: forgery, fraud, mortgage fraud. The evidence was thick, documented, and impossible for Richard Carter to outrun. His attorney pushed a plea deal: probation, restitution, cooperation, no prison if he admitted enough and complied with the investigation. Richard Carter accepted because he had no better option. Carl Benson had already spoken, and paper does not become less paper. He sold his house trying to cover the debt, but it still was not enough. The remaining balance would haunt him for years. I later heard he moved in with his brother in Allentown. I never bothered to verify it. Distance was enough. Vanessa Carter lost 2 real estate listings from church members who no longer trusted her judgment or her silence. She kept her license because she had not signed the documents, but people remembered. Communities forget slowly when betrayal is local. I returned to work at St. Catherine's part-time at first, moving through daylight shifts while my body relearned ordinary rhythms. Patricia Reed adjusted the schedule without making a scene of it, then handed me the rotation and said, "Welcome back, Amelia Carter." In late October, I drove to Norristown and parked on Elm Street outside the brick house with the creaking porch swing. I walked up to the front door carrying my own key, not borrowed, not granted by mercy, but truly and legally mine. Inside, the first thing I smelled was lavender from the sachets Margaret Price had tucked into drawers and closets. Her photograph sat on the mantel, the 2 of us squinting into sunlight on the porch swing years before I understood anything. I sat in her rocking chair and did not turn on the television or check my phone or fill the quiet with noise. For the first time in my life, I sat in a house that belonged to me because someone loved me enough to plan ahead. Not because I earned approval, not because I obeyed, not because I carried guilt well, because I was loved and worth protecting. I used to think being a good daughter meant absorbing every insult, debt reminder, and manipulation with gratitude and lowered eyes. I believed love required silence, obedience, and the willingness to shrink so other people could keep feeling comfortable around their cruelty. I was wrong. Setting a boundary is not revenge. It is survival, and survival sometimes sounds like saying no in public. Sometimes survival looks like a quiet lawyer, notarized papers, a hospital incident report, and the courage to speak without permission. I do not hate Richard Carter. Hate would mean he still controls how deeply I carry him inside my body. He does not. He is simply a man who made terrible choices from pride, addiction, secrecy, and the worship of image over truth. Those things explain him, but they do not excuse him. Explanation is not absolution, especially when harm was deliberate and repeated. I no longer carry his debts on my shoulders, emotional or financial. What belongs to him can stay with him now. If you hear yourself in my story, in the guilt, the silence, the belief that pain is a debt you must repay, listen carefully. You do not owe anyone your health. You do not owe anyone your home. You do not owe anyone your peace. Most of all, you do not owe anyone your life, simply because they raised you, fed you, or keep calling that control love. Margaret Price taught me that not through speeches, but through a house, a letter, and a man named Henry Kessler. I still go to church now, though not that one. Smaller congregation, friendlier coffee, same God, and much less pretending. I sit in the front row these days, not because I need attention, but because I am done hiding in the back. My story did not end when Richard Carter fell. It began the moment I stopped agreeing to disappear for everyone else's comfort. If you are waiting for permission to choose yourself, to protect yourself, to document the truth, let this be that permission. Boundaries are not cruelty. Evidence is not betrayal. Refusing to die quietly for someone else's convenience is not selfishness. If your family calls survival disrespect, remember that people who benefit from your silence usually fear your voice the most. If someone has taught you to confuse guilt with love, pause and ask who gains from that confusion staying alive. Healing does not always arrive as tenderness. Sometimes it arrives as clarity, paperwork, witnesses, and one sentence finally spoken aloud. Tell the truth when you can prove it. Protect yourself before people who harmed you start rewriting the story around your body. Choose friends like Sophie Bennett, professionals like Patricia Reed, and allies like Henry Kessler when life turns dangerous and sharp. And when someone kind like Margaret Price believes in you, believe them back. Love often leaves instructions if you are brave enough to follow. I lived because one nurse looked deeper, one friend drove through rain, one grandmother planned carefully, and I finally stopped apologizing. That is the lesson I leave with you. Protect your name, protect your records, protect your breath, and protect your future. And if you ever stand before a room full of people holding the truth in your hands, speak it clearly and do not look down.